Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. It's my pleasure to say hello to you once again in another Boni session. Today, I have the honor to introduce once again Emily Johnson to you. Emily Johnson is a research assistant at the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law, and she does have a UK background, which is the reason why I invited her already almost a year ago. On the 20th of April 2020, Emily was the guest in edition 11 of Ars Boni, then reporting about the situation in the UK for the first time. And when we had this interview, I don't think that you, Emily, or me would have expected that we can do that we have to do a very similar interview today once again. Thank you again for your time being here. Just very briefly about her background, Emily has an LLB from the University of Southampton and an LLM in technology, innovation, and the law from the University of Edinburgh. And she's one of the key people in the department because she is very intensely involved in very many of our research projects, many of them dealing with data protection issues, in particular when it comes to video surveillance, policing, and similar areas of the law. But she's also very active in issues of e-privacy law and exchange of data inside and outside Europe. Emily, so happy to have you here. Once again, perhaps let us start by asking you very kindly to give us an overview about the overall situation in the UK at the moment. It's a very special day today, I think, as far as I know, because...
Yeah, well, good morning. Thank you for having me again. Today is a special day because we have step 2 of the relaxing of the lockdown, which I think one of the biggest things for people is the pubs are reopening, the gyms are reopening again, people can now go and get their hair cut, which I think is a big thing. We still have like the usual social distancing rules in place, but I think it's a little taste of normality today. So it's quite a big thing. I mean, apart from the snow, which is kind of preventing people from drinking and eating outside, but we'll see.
Yeah. And why is this? I mean, is there a certain incidence rate that is now met, or is it because of the date, or what is the basis for the decision?
So in February, the Prime Minister said that there's basically going to be a 4-stage relaxing of the lockdown. And this is going to be based on a test of 4 factors. So this includes the success of the vaccine rollout, in terms of like how many people get access to the vaccine, whether or not the vaccine is actually successful in reducing deaths and hospital rates. I think also what the hospital situation is and whether or not the NHS can take the pressure of the current situation, and then also the effect of the potential variants. So in evaluating all of these factors, the government is between, I think it was 4 weeks or 5 weeks, they make an assessment of whether or not they can go to the next stage of the relaxing of the lockdown. So all of these kind of situations seems to be progressing well. So today they're relaxing the lockdown, and then it will be reviewed again in 4 weeks. And yeah, so then it's 5-week minimum between each of the stages, apparently. So it's going well. So now they're into the second stage, where things can start opening up a little bit.
So if it turns out now that this has a negative impact, or whether it turns out, and if it turns out that it doesn't have any impact at all, in both cases, it will stay like it is for at least 4 weeks, you said, or 5 weeks?
Will stay like it is, or they can extend it further. It's a minimum of 5 weeks. So it's 4 weeks to make the assessment based on the data of these different factors, and then an additional week to kind of implement the requirements of that.
Okay, that's interesting, because in many continental countries, the rules change in a much quicker circle, right? It's much less than 4 weeks here in many cases. Yeah.
I think there was this big idea from the government that it's about data, not dates. So they really want to look at whether or not what we're doing and what the situation is working, basically.
And legally, it's the government deciding this, or is it the Prime Minister, or it's the government
deciding this? Yeah.
Okay. And are there any challenges of the decisions that are taken by the government, and are there any lawsuits ongoing, or is the situation calm?
So, I mean, we have, so not ongoing, but I think so. It was December of last year. We had a legal case that kind of drew quite a bit of attention. So this was the case of Dolan against the Secretary of State of Health and Social Care. And this was basically a case brought by two claimants, and it went all the way to the Court of Appeal, which is our second highest court in the UK. And they basically challenged the basis for the actual lockdown in March last year, whether or not the government had a legal basis at all. And then they also made some human rights challenges. So it was quite interesting from a legal procedural standpoint, particularly with regard to challenging the actual basis of the lockdown, because this was, so originally it went to the High Court, where they wanted to have a judicial review, whereby the law that was implemented was reviewed by the judiciary to say whether or not it was valid, basically. And this was rejected, and so it then went to the Higher Court. And the Higher Court said that from a procedural standpoint, this is a huge issue because the law changed almost 3 times between March last year when the claim started and December of last year. So when the law changes and they're making basically a claim on a retrospective law, then it has no benefit to precedent. So it's what the court would call purely academic. So it cannot add in any way or be beneficial in any way to the precedent of the law. And the only other way that this could be evaluated or go through judicial review is if there is like a substantial public benefit to doing this, which the court ruled there wasn't. So procedurally, it's really difficult because then you've got to ask how, if not judicial review, do people review the government's decisions to legislate here? Because the law is changing so fast. So I think it's a little bit of a kind of constitutional issue.
Very interesting what you say, because it's rather similar to the situation here in Austria, but the Austrian Constitutional Court then decided that it would still decide on a regulation, although it was no longer enforced, for the very reason that they considered it to be important to still maintain judicial review. Different in the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, they said that they didn't want to, the decision in the end, so they went through this reasoning that it was purely academic and there was no public benefit, but they decided anyway to review it. So that I think that it wouldn't be challenged again. And they said that there was the legal grounds, the government did have the ground to implement this law in the first place based on Public Health Act 1984. But then there were some interesting human rights claims as well. I think one of the claimants basically said that the lockdown infringed his personal liberty, because it was like some kind of house arrest sort of situation, but that was completely thrown out because there were so many exceptions to the lockdown and being able to go out. That was completely rejected. The same with the Article 8 convention right was also challenged, and the court just said, although it was definitely infringed, that it was done so legitimately based on Article 8.2 of the convention, because the whole public health situation, and also they established that it was proportionate, and they justified this with case law from European Court of Human Rights and so on. One of the biggest issues actually, which is kind of being talked about a lot now, and I don't know whether you've seen it in the news with protests in the UK. So in this case, they also challenged the Article 11 right to peaceful assembly and association. So this was also rejected by the court here because they said that you can protest as long as there's a reasonable excuse. So this has been like a huge issue in terms of what this reasonable excuse is to go out and protest. So we had quite a big, I don't know if you heard about it or if it made it internationally, but basically there was a young woman who was murdered just walking home in southwest London. And this sparked vigils and protests because it's obviously a horrific situation from an individual standpoint and for the family and so on, but it also sparked a bigger discussion about just the ability for a woman to walk home from a friend's house without being murdered. And so there were vigils. So we have a full lockdown, and there were vigils with people gathering in Clapham Common in London. And even the Duchess of Cambridge brought flowers, so on. And one of the biggest issues here was whether or not this was a reasonable excuse to go out and kind of not break the lockdown rules, but go beyond the lockdown. And this was referred to a High Court judge before the vigil, and the judge said that it's not a reasonable excuse, but in this case, but there may be reasonable excuses, but didn't clarify. So then after this, the police got involved, and there was some pretty, I would say, disproportionate use of force and aggressive police officers, which is complete, like, towards young women who were at the vigil, which was completely ironic because this woman, Sarah Everard, was actually murdered by a police officer. So it's just so much irony, and some really disturbing pictures came out of that. And one of the biggest issues here is the lack of legal clarity. So I think, what is a reasonable excuse to go out? The police didn't know whether or not, I think, whether or not they had the ability to, I guess, police the situation in a certain way, but also protesters didn't know if they could go out and protest here. So there was an open letter that was written, I think, by something like 60 MPs and peers, in which they said that there needs to be legal clarity here because it's a fundamental right and no one knows what's going on. So this has, I think, been a pretty big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is protesting against the lockdown a reasonable excuse?
This is the thing. No one knows.
No one knows. Okay.
No one knows at the moment. So I think they're conducting, I know the Metropolitan Police is conducting inquiries about the behaviour of the police in this situation, and also the government is conducting inquiries about the legal clarity situation.
And are there any protests at the moment against the lockdown? So do people go to demonstrations?
There have been. I don't know if they're going on. I know there have been, but it's not quite the same as, I mean, I've seen here in Vienna. Yeah. It's a regular thing on a Saturday, or at least it was.
Still is, at least last Saturday it was again.
Yeah. But I don't think it's quite as regular. But that's not considered, I think, a reasonable excuse.
Okay. I see. Okay. Emily, thank you. I think one point that we should also stress a little bit is the issue of or the progress in vaccinating people.
Yeah.
And I have two questions here. The first one is about the overall situation. The second one, no, it's actually three questions. The second one is whether there is any concern about the vaccine, because the UK was very much depending on AstraZeneca. And the third one is, does that have any, in your view at least, does that have any impact on how people see the Brexit?
Okay. So I think, in terms of like the rollout and how it's happening, there's a big uptake, I think, in the vaccine. We've got something like almost 40 million people have had one of the vaccinations, and something like 7 million have had both. And there's a big uptake in the vaccine itself and a big rollout. I think when it comes to the Brexit situation, it's tricky because, I mean, from our standpoint, it's difficult, I think, with all of the vaccines when it comes to the evidence of, the whole blood clot thing. We've had so many people, so many millions of people have now been vaccinated with AstraZeneca, and there are a small group of people who have had the blood clot, and they're saying, okay, now it's connected. In my view, this is the case with a lot of medication and vaccines. There's always going to be some kind of risk, always. But I don't think this, at least generally from what I've seen and what I've read and people I've spoken to, this is not putting people off.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, from a continental point of view, it's, I mean, there were quite some issues here, as you certainly know, also in the news, whether or not it was appropriate to export vaccines to the UK, and whether the contract that the Commission had concluded with AstraZeneca had to be read in the sense that Europe had the right, I mean, the continent had the right, or the European Union had the right to expect some kind of priority here. But that was not an issue as far as you see it.
No, I mean, I've read about it from, it's
from
funny
here,
because I read
from here, but not from the other side.
I read newspapers from here and also from the UK, and the perspective in the UK, at least from the newspapers I've read, are that, well, we have a contract with you. This is like our vaccine. So, and they also have a contract. I mean, I don't know, is the priority based on the geographic location of the factory producing it and the need? I don't know. It's like there are contractual obligations. If the UK came first, if the EU came first, then they have to fulfill those contractual obligations.
Yeah, certainly. But as far as I understand the situation, there is a slightly different phrasing in the different contracts,
Yeah.
Yeah. So contract law is important. Yeah. In any case. Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
there's certainly the view that this is our vaccine. There's definitely people with that view in the UK.
Yeah. And 40 million people more or less vaccinated also means probably that you already see quite an impact on the infection rates and on everything, right?
Yeah, so I've seen and so I've read it's made a huge difference.
Yeah. Fine. Which brings me to the last set of questions, Emily, if I may, which is about university education, exams at universities and so on. Could you briefly describe how it is at the moment?
Sure. So, I mean, just looking at the government guidance, it's it's like follow the general government rules on lockdowns and local rules on lockdowns and so on. But there's also an element of discretion with universities because they're not public bodies, they are private bodies in the UK. So I know just from looking at my previous universities, just out of curiosity, I know, for example, the University of Southampton is completely doing remote teaching. Everything is remote unless you have to go in and you cannot complete your course. Like say there's lab work to be done or certain engineering requirements that require you to be there in person. Otherwise, it's all remote, and that includes exams. And I think it's the same in Edinburgh as well, and lots of other universities, that remote teaching where possible.
Did it change anything in how people organize the exams? And did it change anything on the amount of international students that you're aware of?
I haven't seen any figures when it comes to the international students. I know with the exams, and from having looked at several universities, it's literally discretion of the universities themselves in how they do that, whether that's, I mean, kind of like at the University of Vienna, you decide how best to do it and how best to test the students and so on. I think one of the bigger issues has been university admissions. So for the A-level students, and how, like, most students are learning from home, most school students, and it's about how to examine those, whether or not to rely on predicted grades. This has been a big issue for university offers. So this is something that I think is ongoing in terms of discussion.
And the economical situation of some of the universities has significantly suffered from the pandemic, as far as I read about it. But that, just true. Nothing to report on this, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, but it's also, I mean, it's also very difficult, I would say, for the students, because it's university fees aren't cheap in the UK, and sadly, and also the accommodation is very expensive at the same time. So whether you're paying for accommodation that you're not in, or you're just stuck in this accommodation and you're not getting, I'd say, the services you think or you would normally expect because of the COVID situation, I think it's detrimental for everyone involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good, Emily. Thank you. One last question about, is there any website, any journal, any reading that you would recommend to our viewers, in addition to the case reports that you already mentioned and that I will put into the show notes, obviously? Yeah,
absolutely. So, I mean, the .gov UK is like one of the best in terms of the rules. They're always updating the rules and the requirements, particularly if anyone's thinking of traveling, because you need to, so on. The government website is one of the best resources for that. Also the BBC in terms of figures, and I'd say it's fairly impartial. The Law Society Gazette is a really good resource for legal news in the UK, and particularly related to COVID and looking after lawyers and looking out for lawyers and what's going on with the legislation and so on. I'd say that's one of the good legal resources.
Thank you so much, Emily. We will put this into the show notes, as I said. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our listeners for your time. Have a wonderful week and all the best to all of you. See you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.